Hello, everyone, and welcome to today's University Business web seminar, which is entitled Leveraging Benchmarking Data to Understand Your Investments, Perspectives from Oregon State, which is brought to you by the generous support of our sponsor, Helio Campus. Now, before we get started, I'd just like to share just a few housekeeping items with you all. For technical support, please use the chat panel, which you can find on the right side of your screen. Then select on my name, which is Stephen Blackburn, and then type your message if you're having any technical issues, and I should get to you shortly. If for whatever reason you don't have any computer speakers, or maybe you prefer to listen privately, then please just dial the phone number and access code that I will be posting in the chat window shortly, so look out for that. We will also be welcoming any questions that you have today. There will be a Q&A session, which will take place at the end of the presentation today. To submit a question, please just use the Q&A panel, which you can find at the bottom right side of your screen. Then send your questions to all panelists, which should be the default option. If you currently don't see the chat or maybe the Q&A panels as well, just again, look to the right side of your screen and then click on the expand triangle, which is directly in front of the panel name. Also, this is my last thing I'll note. If you would like to access the web seminar at a later time, everyone who is registered as well as who is attending today will receive an email with a link to the slide as well as an archive recording. And with that, it is my pleasure to introduce to all of you our speakers today. We have Nicole Dolan, who is the Director of Budget Development over at Oregon State University, and Rejani Kurtane, who is the Director of Research at Helio Campus. It's great to have you with us today, and welcome. All right, you may begin.
All right, thank you for that introduction. It's great to have everyone joining us here today. I will start us off in this webinar. First, we had our speaker introductions. Next, I'll provide you with a brief overview of the Helio Campus Benchmarking Consortium to provide you with an understanding of the types of data that we analyze, the types of insights that we provide, and ways in which the members of the Benchmarking Consortium can use those insights. I'll then pass it over to Nicole Dolan. Nikki will be sharing with you examples of how Oregon State has leveraged the benchmarking data to understand their investments. We'll then have a section where I'll share with you some research from the Benchmarking Consortium where we've linked human capital investment data to outcome metrics, specifically in the area of student success. And as was mentioned earlier, we'll end with a Q&A section. So to start us off with the overview of the Helio Campus Benchmarking Consortium, our focus is on measuring human capital investment across our members' institutions. And we start with data that's provided by our members. This includes all internal human capital investment data, for example, payroll file data. We also capture material external labor in the form of external contracts, such as dining contracts, maintenance contracts, et cetera, that an institution might have. And we also collect a number of what we call analysis or normalizing factors. So for example, number of students, number of employees, acres maintained, square feet cleaned, etc. And the goal of these normalizing factors is to be able to slice and dice the data in a variety of different ways to allow for benchmarking apples to apples across members. Once we have all of the data, we put the data into a standardized framework, a standard activity model that encompasses 10 activity areas, 9 of which are administrative, 1 is an academic activity area. And in the next few slides, I'll share with you more detail on what that standard activity model actually includes. Once we have the data in that standardized framework, we can then provide benchmarking both internally within an institution and also externally across members within the consortium. And we then provide insights to our members, which can then be linked to initiatives, strategy, goals at the university, as well as desired outcomes. We then provide these insights in the form of insights meetings, and the members also get access to our benchmarking platform so that they can use the internal and external metrics to support and improve decision-making. To give you a sense of the members that are in the Helio Campus Benchmarking Consortium, you can see the members represented on this map here. We serve 77 active member institutions across 35 states, including Canada. And the members really span a variety of different characteristics, different university sizes, different Carnegie classifications, as well as a number of other different characteristics as well, public and private institutions, et cetera. I mentioned earlier the standardized framework that we call our standard activity model. And here you can see the 10 activity areas that are in this model. 9 of these are administrative. We have communications, development, facilities, finance, general administration, human resources, information technology, research administration, and student services. We recently added the academics activity area to allow for benchmarking of academics as well. And you'll see that in addition to these high-level activity areas, we also have what we call several sub-activity areas within each of these activity areas that allows for a more granular level of benchmarking, both within and across member institutions. This slide here highlights a few examples of how members can use the benchmarking analyses and data. So with the benchmarking data, members are often interested in comparing their human capital investments to benchmark institutions, and this allows universities to identify focus areas of higher staffing intensity for their particular institution in order to then be able to ask questions about how those resources are being allocated and to identify ways to perhaps reimagine those resource allocations. This can lead to follow-up data and analysis that's requested from Helio Campus to identify drivers of those human capital investments at the division, department, title, or employee level. Because we also analyze where the investments are occurring across your campus, this can help enhance understanding of centralized and decentralized investments. Members can use the data and insights on investment drivers to inform strategic initiatives and budget planning processes. And in data and the insights that we provide, we are also a benchmarking consortium, and we do encourage consortium members to connect with each other. We can help facilitate those connections so that they can really talk to each other and learn about best practices. And with that, I'll turn it over to Nicole Dolan at Oregon State so that she can talk to you about how Oregon State has been using the benchmarking data.
Thank you, Ranjani. So we have been a member of Helio Campus before it was ABC Insights since 2016. And so through our years of work with Helio, we've been able to do several different analyses that I will go over today. A little bit first about OSU. So we are an R1 International Public Research University. We are one of 3 land, sea, space, and sun grant universities in the US. We have an operating budget of $1.4 billion and about $450 million in research awards. We have 32,312 students, which is about 26,644 undergrads and 5,668 graduates for professional students. We're located on 2 campuses. We have 11 colleges and 12 agricultural experiment stations and extension programs in all 36 counties in Oregon. We have a large online and in-person programs of about 9,000 students of our online and 23,000 students in person on our Corvallis campus. And for purposes of our study today, our headcount employees about 5,500 full-time employees and 4,000 part-time employees. And one other caveat, most importantly, we are the beavers. We are not the ducks, which are the University of Oregon south of us. We get that a lot though from Oregon. So we have used consortium data in 3 distinct ways in our office. We use external peer analysis, and we've done those on our Ombuds office, our audit office, legal services, admissions, marketing, are some of the studies that we've done for external peer comparisons. We've done a consultative analysis where we reached out to connect with peers, as Ranjani had mentioned. They will connect us with other universities that have programs that we're looking at building or departments that we were looking at starting up, and to learn about best practices and what went well, what didn't go well. And I'll talk about that a little bit later. And then we've also used our data for an internal review within our own platform, being able to compare what's how much is working in our departments, who's doing what, like within our relations and marketing? Do we have those centralized? Are they decentralized? That seems to be the most, the questions that I get a lot are central versus decentral of some of our departments, such as information services, our human resource department. Admissions office asked me that too. We have quite a bit of those. So the three studies that I'm going to look at today are custodial services. This is one of the ones that we use for our external review. We were reviewing our existing services against our peers to help make decisions on spend and whether we want to have leave it outsourced, which is right now contracted out, or if we should bring it in-house and if we should pay for the services ourselves and not have it outsourced. Our project management office, that was our consultative review that we did. We were looking at starting up a project management office, so we talked with other universities about what was working and didn't work for their PMO offices. And the last review that I'll go over, the last analysis, is on student success. And we reviewed our investments there to determine areas that were succeeding and what areas we could improve in. I think it's important to note at this time that the data that we use in this analysis is just one piece of the information that we use when making these decisions. So the data really helps inform the decisions, and it helps us identify where we need to ask further questions, but it's never, it's not sufficient alone to just make a decision based on what we see or what we think. There's lots of different factors that go into the decisions. So the first one that we did was this custodial services, and this is an example of the graph that we get from Helio Campus. This is one where, as I mentioned, we were looking to see if outsourcing our custodial services, which it currently is a contract right now, is the best methodology for us, or if we could maybe save some money or save some. The issue that we had is our service level wasn't sufficient, and so we were looking, if we brought it in-house, could we raise that service level? Once we identified our peers, and it's another important thing to note is when we look at peers in the consortium data, it's not so much our typical peers or our aspirational peers. We look at peers that are at the same operating level that we are, so that we can have a bit more consistency in our analysis. So we're not looking for the pie in the sky. We're looking at the folks that are similar to us in spend to see how we are doing in spend. So as you can see on this graphic, we are actually spending less overall than our peers. And most of our peers are doing it in-house. So you can tell from the hashtags on there's a little key down here at the bottom right. Our external labor is the hashtags, and the solid is centralized, and the lighter gray or the lighter orange is decentralized services. So for us, we do have a little bit of in-house. We have our housing and dining operations do their own in-house, and that's decentralized. And then their contract that I was talking about, this is our external labor. So you can see from our peers, we're much higher in our outsourced. We don't ask in this example, in this analysis, we don't look for the service level, but we do look at just the square feet cleaned and the amount spent. Another view of the graph. This puts us in comparison. The other slide had the peers combined. This has the peers broken out. And again, you can see where we're overall lower in total spend and higher in external labor percentage. Ultimately, after doing this review, we did decide to keep our services outsourced, but we were able to renegotiate our contract and service level and increase that. And I should mention that this was actually all before COVID, the pandemic hit. The next review we did was more of a consultative review. We have a project management office we were looking at standing up. And one of the ideas that we had was maybe we reach out to our peers who had project management offices to find out where the office was located, number one, and what type of services they offered. So our client services manager helped us identify universities across the consortium that had project management offices. She was able to further help identify the number of staff in those offices and help locate where the office was located in their org charts. One of the biggest challenges we had in this analysis was that defining what a project manager was a little bit challenging. We seem to use that title quite a bit in several areas. At all of our universities, we have a title title game I think we play. So what we ended up doing was we removed all titles that were related to capital projects or research, as we were mostly focused on portfolio project management. She was able then to connect us with 2 of the universities who had these project management offices. And we were able to talk with them, and it helped us immensely. So what we were looking at was like I had mentioned, like where the office was located and the amount of staff and the way that the staff was helping units across campus with their projects. So one of the universities was dissolving their project management office, and the other one was an established unit. So we had kind of 2 ends of the spectrum to talk about, and it was very helpful to understand in the one that was dissolving why, what worked or what didn't work, particularly in that office. And actually what it ended up doing was just kind of combining it. It merged into a different office. They just no longer call it the project management office. But they were able to both really give us great insight and ideas and things for us to consider and ways to structure our department. We also were able to, from the office that was dissolving, that office actually helped us with a lot of forms and position descriptions and process documents, which again gave our office a great head start as we were embarking in the new office, which was fantastic, very helpful for us. So we did stand up this project management office, and with the help of using the guidance of both of those universities. So that was pretty fantastic for us. And so far still successful. It's only been a year. The last analysis that we did was an internal analysis, and this is the one that we did on student success. And what I have here is the Helio Campus Standard Activity Model for Student Services. This is one of the ones that Ranjani had mentioned earlier. And this is particularly student services, and then these are the sub-activities within these student services. The analysis that I'm going to show you right now was done in fiscal year 20, and it was from the FY18 and FY fiscal year 19 data. So I'm going to call this a tale of 2 colleges, and I've changed the college names to be College N and College D. And as a spoiler alert, those are my initials. So in no way am I favoring any college above any other college. So when we reviewed the student success, they reviewed the student service investments per student for colleges compared to the 6-year graduation rate. As a side note, we didn't review 4-year yet. We just looked at the 6-year graduation rate. The primary insight here was, and the initial assumption or initial conclusion was, colleges that invest more on student services tend to have higher 6-year graduation rates. College N provides a great example of high student service investment resulting in strong student outcomes. College D invested less in student services and had the second to lowest 6-year graduation rate. This is another graphic of our investment per student and the 6-year graduation rates. This graph also correlates to the sizes of our colleges. It's not just the investment on student success is the only factor that drives into their success. When we reviewed the student service investments by sub-activities, College D invested less than average in the 3 categories most closely associated with student outcomes, which was academic advising, career services, and student engagement. Additionally, College D had the second highest 1-year retention rate, but yet the second lowest 6-year graduation rate. Here is just College N, and so you can see some of the details for College N on this slide. College N had low incoming SAT scores and a high percentage of Pell Grant recipients, which are typically associated with lower graduation rates. However, College N has the highest 6-year graduation rate, as well as high retention and graduation rates for Pell Grant recipients and underrepresented minorities, which is great. Good job, College N. So then we looked at College D. From the data, College D has the strongest students with an average incoming freshman SAT score of 1,260 and a cumulative GPA in fiscal year 18 of 3.15, which again are typically associated with higher graduation rates. But again, as mentioned, they had the second lowest in 6-year graduation. Additionally, they have the fewest Pell Grant recipients at 24.2%, and underrepresented minorities were also lower than the average. International students were higher than average. So this is the information we're getting from this graph. So as I mentioned before, it's not just one set of data that can help us drive or make decisions from this information. So let me tell you a little bit of history about my College D, and it helps shed some light into what we're looking at. Prior to fiscal year 20, the college used a professional, or what we call a pro school model, for controlling progression of students into their undergrad programs. This required students to apply to pro school after completion of their sophomore year, and acceptance into pro school was based on attaining a minimum GPA in a subset of courses varying across degree programs. With the goal of improving student success, College D replaced this pro school model with a continuous progression model. In the new model, all students have a first-year general program experience for exploration and developing skills for student success, and then they opt into any college discipline provided they maintain a GPA of 2.5 and make adequate progress. Students could then start taking upper division courses as soon as they met prerequisites, giving them greater schedule flexibility. Students who fail to meet progressive goals are given warnings in the first term, probation in the second term, and suspended after the third term of failing to meet expectations. This takes a more holistic look at academic success, and feedback and support are given continuously. Students who fail to receive feedback earlier and those who stumble in 1 or 2 classes will not be held up from continuing to take courses in their program sequences in most cases. So College D was seeing the same results that are provided in this slide. And so they took action and made this change effective in fiscal year 20. This approach also changes how resources would be distributed throughout the college, with all areas of the college helping with student success, instead of just the 3 key areas of advising, career services, and student engagement that we had noted before. So all functions within the college are really helping the student succeed. So this, as I mentioned, this is a good example of how our data should lead to more questions and help inform changes in practice. And the data is not an end in itself and doesn't always say much about the why of things without digging in a little bit deeper. What we're doing next, you see my next slide? I went blank. Oh, I can wing it. Our next steps that College D's change from pro school to the continuous progression has been in place for 2 years now, going on 3. And so we'll see if the change is creating the outcomes they are intended with student success. Basically, we're going to see if the change is working to achieve their goals. Also, we'll look at what seems to be working for College N, and would it make sense to establish similar practices at other of our colleges, seeing if there's some nuggets of information we could share with the other colleges. And then maybe we could look at the 4-year graduation rate and see how those trends compare with what we are seeing for the 6-year trends. It's not advancing on my side. Ranjani, is it advancing for you?
I see your next step slide currently. If you want to make me the presenter, I can advance to the next slide.
I think my next one is just questions that, as we mentioned, questions will be in the Q&A at the end of the presentation. So let me pass this back to you. There you go.
All right. Thank you, Nikki, for sharing those examples of how Oregon State has been using the data, and also thinking about the data and asking questions using the data as prompts. That's very helpful. In the next section, what we'll do is to present some research linking data from the Heliocampus Benchmarking Consortium to outcome metrics. So this is building on what Nikki just shared from Oregon State, where Oregon State was looking internally at their academic units to look at investments in student services and links to student success metrics. We can also look for a particular institution externally to see how is that relationship comparing to benchmark institutions. And with the research we've done, we've also looked across the members that are in the consortium to say, more broadly speaking, what types of trends are we seeing in terms of investments in student services and relationships with student success outcome metrics. As Nikki just shared, it can be quite powerful to look at the conjunction of human capital investment metrics with outcome data. And what this can allow members to do is to understand how their administrative human capital investment relates to outcomes. They can compare their relationship between administrative investments and outcomes, both internally for different units within their institution and also externally to benchmark institutions. You can also set outcome-based targets and try to align resource allocation decisions accordingly. And longitudinally over time, you can also evaluate trends and outcomes in human capital investments. So if there are adjustments that are being made to administrative investments, you can track over time if you're seeing positive adjustments also in outcome metrics and whether you are reaching those desired targets. We can use outcome metrics to look at the return on investment of administrative human capital investments across several areas. On the left side of the slide here, you can see different administrative areas within our standard activity model, our SAM. On the right, you can see related outcome metrics. So for example, when we look at human capital investments in development, for example, if we're looking at the level of spend or FTE for staffing, at an institution, we can look to see how are those staffing levels related to the development funds raised or related to the level of alumni donations. If we look at research administration staffing levels, we can see how that relates to externally sponsored research expenses. With public safety staffing levels, public safety is a sub-activity within our facilities activity area. We can look at the relationship between staffing levels and public safety incidents and see how that compares to benchmarks. And what we'll be focusing on with the research that I'll be sharing today is the student services area, where we can look at levels of investment in student services staffing and look at relationships with outcome metrics, such as retention rates, graduation rates, and admissions yield rates. And the rationale for introducing this analysis for our members was, as we're all aware, there are rising concerns about the cost of higher education. There's an increased spotlight on what is the effectiveness, what's the return on investment of a college education. And with growing budget constraints, colleges and universities are focused not only on the effectiveness of their student services, but also the efficiency of those student services as well. So we did introduce this analysis looking at the relationship between human capital investments in student services with outcome metrics and student success to our members for this very reason, to be able to look at that relationship and compare it to comparable benchmark institutions. And with the research that I'll be presenting in the next few slides, we'll be looking across the consortium to see what kinds of trends we can see across the members that are in the consortium. We did focus this research on the student services area of our standard activity model, and you can see the sub-activity areas that are listed here in the yellow box. And there are a few considerations that I just want to highlight before we show the results from the research. One is that with this analysis, we were really aiming to provide at a high level relationships between student services areas and outcome metrics. We did focus on FY20 data from members that are in the consortium, since that's the most recent available consortium data. But certainly with the onset of the pandemic, we do realize that COVID-19 may have impacted the results. And with that focus on FY20 investment data, we are looking at the relationship between human capital investments that were made in FY20 in the area of student services and outcome metrics in the fall of 2020. The idea being that human capital investments in a given fiscal year would likely impact outcome metrics for the subsequent fall. But of course, it's important to note that student services initiatives may have outcome gains that are realized over longer timescales. And that's where looking at these relationships over time can be really beneficial in order to look at that relationship between investments and outcomes over a longer time scale. I do want to point out here as well that with looking at these relationships between staffing levels in student services and outcome metrics, we are looking at correlations between these relationships. We certainly can't imply causality, but that being said, it can still be quite informative to see how these metrics are changing together over time. I do also want to mention that outcome metrics that we're focusing on, we're looking at, for example, retention rates, graduation rates, but we are not looking at metrics such as student services quality and student satisfaction. And these are also important metrics that should be considered when evaluating the impact of student services initiatives. With the student success outcome metrics that we looked at on the slide that you're seeing currently, you can see each of the outcome metrics that we used, the source for that outcome metrics, and the description for the outcome metric. The research was broader than what I'll be sharing with you here today during the webinar. What we'll be focusing on for the purposes of today's webinar are the full-time retention rate metric. That's the percentage of fall 2019 first years that remained enrolled in fall of 2020, as well as the 6-year graduation rate, which was the overall 6-year grad rate for students in the fall 2014 cohort. The larger research that we did also looked at admissions yield rate and 6-year graduation rate for underrepresented minorities as well. And with first looking at retention rates, what we did was to look at the correlation between staffing levels in each of our student services areas, with staffing levels being FTEs performing those student services functions on a per student basis. And that's what you're seeing on the x-axis of these charts here. On the y-axis, we're looking at the fall 2020 retention rate. So what we're seeing in these graphs is that in the areas of academic advising, career services, and international programs, we see a positive correlation or a positive relationship between the levels of staffing in these 3 areas and retention rates. Or put another way, the higher the level of investment in these 3 areas, the higher the retention rate that we're seeing. You'll also note here that we are doing this research. We did look in our sample set across the consortium, which encompassed about 43 universities with FY20 data. But of course, as I mentioned earlier, with the map of members that are in our consortium, there are many different types of members that are in the consortium. So we did want to shed some light on what types of members are in the consortium by looking at different university sizes. We divided the universities, the members of the consortium, into the groups that you can see here color-coded by different color dots. The yellow dots represent large institutions. The light blue represents mid-size universities with a high intensity of research. The dark blue represents mid-sized institutions, the black are smaller institutions, and the gray represents our smallest institutions that are in the consortium. And we divided the universities into these various categories using a number of factors such as magnitude of operating expenses, student headcount, and magnitude of external sponsored research expenses. Overall, however, across all of these institutions, we are seeing that there is this positive relationship for these 3 areas: academic advising, career services, and international programs with higher retention rates. In the next slide, we'll show the same types of results, but now focusing on 6-year graduation rates. And what we see here is a similar trend in that there are certain areas within student services, namely career services, international programs, this category that we call other, which is really honors programs, life skills support that's provided to students, for example, stress management, recreational services, and residential services. So higher FTE investments on a per student basis in these sub-activity areas within student services were associated with higher 6-year graduation rates across the members in the consortium. And in thinking about these patterns of results, so which sub-activity areas are associated with higher retention and graduation rates, what stood out to us is that these are the areas, for example, academic advising, international programs, career services, rec services, residential services, student engagement, etc. These are the areas that are really forming the key aspect of a student's college experience. There are other important aspects of student services that we do capture, such as registration and financial aid, that are certainly important, but however, we did not find any significant correlations between administrative human capital investments in these areas and retention and graduation rates. I noted earlier that across the consortium, we have many different types of universities. We have different size universities, different magnitude of research expenses, different student counts, but different universities, of course, also have different characteristics of their student population. So we wanted to look to see, are there different types of students at these institutions that could serve as explanatory variables for the pattern of results that we're seeing? So what you're seeing on this slide is we also looked for each of these member size categories to see what the variability is like across the consortium in terms of the selectivity of members, in terms of the median percentage, the number of students that are admitted essentially by each type of institution, as well as standardized test scores in the form of the ACT 25th percentile score. So if we look at this top row here, what we're seeing is that in terms of the percentage of students that are admitted, the larger universities in general tend to have a lower percentage of students that are admitted compared to the smaller universities. If we look at the standardized test scores, we see that the large universities and the smallest universities tended to have the higher standardized test scores compared to these mid-size and smaller universities. So what the data are showing us here is that there clearly is variability in the selectivity of members in terms of the percentage of students that are admitted and in terms of the standardized test scores of these incoming student populations. And certainly as more and more universities go test optional, we'll need to add supplemental metrics in order to be able to characterize aspects of the student population. But we use these metrics here as a starting point. So what we did in the next step was to look at these variables as control variables in order to be able to look at the relationship between staffing levels in student services with outcome metrics, retention and graduation rates, after controlling for these differences in student populations between different types of institutions in the consortium. And what we found when we did that was after we controlled for standardized test scores and selectivity, the only relationship, the only correlation that remained significant was between academic advising investments and retention rates. So after we take the standardized test scores of students, after we take member selectivity into account, we still see a significant relationship, a significant positive relationship between investments in academic advising on an FTE per student basis with higher retention rates. So across universities, we're seeing the larger the investment in academic advising, the higher the retention rate. So clearly there are characteristics of student populations that need to be taken into account, but these results do suggest that there are some interesting relationships to be explored between student services investments and the return on those investments in terms of outcome metrics, such as retention and graduation rates. This research presents relationships at a high level. Again, we do perform these types of analysis for individual member institutions so that rather than looking across the entire consortium where there are many differences between different types of institutions, for a given member institution, we can look specifically for that member and look at internal comparisons between academic units, such as, for example, what Nikki shared with us. We can also look externally at other benchmark institutions to be able to look at, for the level of investment that you have at your institution and student services, what are the associated outcome metrics? how does that compare to other benchmark institutions? And over time, what types of changes are you making in your administrative investments? And how is that tracking with outcomes such as retention and graduation rates? Are those outcome metrics trending in a way that is desired and that is meeting your institutional targets? So with that, I'll pass it back to Stephen so that we can move on to the Q&A section and get to some of our participant and attendee questions today.
Perfect. Yeah, thank you, Ranjani and Nicole, for your insights. And like you were saying, now we have some time for a Q&A where our speakers can answer your questions today. So if you haven't already, to submit your question, just to please access the Q&A panel, which you can access at the bottom right-hand side of your screen, and then click on Q&A as opposed to chat. If you submit your question and we don't get to it today, then I'm sure that our team over at Helio Campus will be more than happy to reach out to you individually following the event. So look out for that. All right, so this first question, Nicole, this one is for you. So we received a question asking if you could please share more about how you work with Helio Campus. You know, what is your role versus what you may rely on the team for at Helio?
Sure. So I am the project manager here at Oregon State. So I am basically the liaison for Helio Campus. So I am the one that helps work with our IR team to get the data, our payroll data to submit every year, kind of scrub the data, make sure it's accurate. I do some internal testing to make sure it kind of matches what our labor spend is in total before I send it over. And then I work with our client services manager, Emma is ours, and we go through the data to bucket it into the central, decentral, get some clarification on jobs, titles. I work as the liaison with our human resource office who provides the position descriptions that they use to review all the functions of each department, of each person, I mean, and in the department they work in. So I'm kind of a fancy liaison. Then when I share that with our leadership, when I share it with our colleges, I am the person that meets with the college leaders. I will pull the data that I can get from an internal standpoint and some of the benchmarking data, anything that we need a deeper dive on. If I need to find out anything more specific about a particular university and why we might be different in the benchmarking, that's when I reach out to Helio, and our client services manager would connect me with that university. Or sometimes they will help me do a deeper dive as well. Sometimes they can get to data that I don't have access to. So that's when I need a little bit more insight, a little bit more information. That's when my Helio partners come through and either help me connect to the department or the other university, or they help me with the more detailed information.
Awesome, perfect, thank you. Now this next question looks like it's for you, Ranjani. So at one point you mentioned that quality and satisfaction, that they weren't taken into account in one of the examples you provided. But you also mentioned that these are key metrics. So our participant was wondering, have you been able to consider these factors in other analyses, conducted with members?
That's a great question. We do have a tool called the Administrative Quality Satisfaction Survey that we are working with members on, where what we do is we work with member institutions to administer that survey to different customers, different stakeholders at the university. So for example, faculty, staff, students, and that's a key way in which we can get some of those student satisfaction metrics and then be able to relate that to human capital investment data. And we do work with our members as well. If they have any internal student satisfaction data that they can provide to us, those are additional outcome metrics that we can integrate into the analyses as well.
Perfect. Thank you for that. This next question looks like it is for you, Nicole. So at OSU, how did you translate this data into budgetary allocation decisions to the academic and administrative units?
It's a great question. We don't. So We use an RCM model at our university. So our academic budgetary allocation is based on the prior 3 years of student credit hours and degrees awarded in those colleges. And our administrative side, it's still basically an incremental model. What we use the data for is decision-making packages. So we don't adapt the budget based on those decisions though. So what we look at is our staffing correctly? And then discussions at the executive leadership would decide as one component of this, if we're looking at our peers and saying we're low in, I don't know, say the general counsel's office, should we add more staff compared to our peers? Does it make sense with our workload? So it's just one factor that would help maybe in decisions on the administrative side. On the academic side, that's based on student credit hours and degrees awarded.
Perfect. Thank you. Let's just see what else we have here. So this one might for either you, Nicole, or Ranjani. How are these types of findings commonly communicated across stakeholders at any given university?
Nikki, I'll turn to you. I'd love to, if you can share at Oregon State how the findings have been communicated internally. I think that could be great.
So they are communicated to our upper leadership. Right now, it's on a case-by-case basis with leadership within the colleges. One of the reasons is, as you can imagine, if you put out a slide that doesn't have any context around it, people will make up their own context for it. So this is only on a more personal basis that we communicate any information that we find or areas that we think need to be looked into further. But we don't like post it on a website. We don't put it out. It's a little bit more private with the deans, private with the colleges to see what decisions that they want to make, because it's just not that easy to look at it and say, oh my gosh, we're 10 people below our peers, because it may not be true. We have differences in the types. A good example is our audit office. Our audit office is a compliance, audit, and ethics office. Other universities have just internal audit. Other universities have just compliance offices. So it really is not something that we can just accept on face value. We have to dig a little further. And so that's one of the reasons we don't like to share it openly, because we don't want people to get maybe the wrong takeaways that we don't believe are true takeaways from the data. So we share it with a context around it.
Awesome. Thank you. Another question that came in. So as a land grant school, what are some sort of complexities did you have to work through in order to compare, OSU against peers that may not be land grant schools?
I think that's a good question. That's very hard. So we typically don't compare peers that are not land grants like we are. In the model, in the consortium model, you can select the attributes that you want of the peers that you're selecting. So we tend to limit, for example, we would not select a campus that has a medical school. We would select the one that has the land grant. So we try to keep our apples and apples the same. Being a land grant is it's been a bit of a challenge knowing where to it's more of a challenge of where to bucket our extension offices within our university.
Thank you. This next question is again for you, Nicole. Did you use these results to inform practice? And actually our participant gave an example, like do academic advising models vary? So if College N was successful, did you do like a deep dive of their practice and adapt some of the tactics?
That's one of our next steps. So it's a great question. And yes, we will be reaching out and finding out what is working so well for our College N. They do seem to really have a good handle on it. And so, yes, we will be reaching out and finding out what's working and sharing those methodologies with other colleges that we think would benefit from it. Every academic department is different though on our college campus. So it would really be whether or not, if we feel that it would really be beneficial for other colleges, and just sharing information is always good. Communication is always helpful in my opinion. So yes, we will be doing that.
Great, thank you. We have a few more questions too, but I just would like to say very quickly, if you have not yet submitted a question, please feel free to do so by inserting the questions into the Q&A panel, which you can find in the lower right side of your screen. So this next question, they mentioned that it sounds like you actively collaborate with other consortium members. Can you share the various ways you're able to do so?
Sure, I can provide some general examples, and Nikki, if you could, speak to your experience, I think that would be great. We do have consortium events. For example, we have member meetings, we have member summits. Of course, with the pandemic, these have all become virtual. But prior to the pandemic, and hopefully soon as well, we'll be able to have some in-person networking where we find that our members are really able to connect with each other and talk to each other, have that sharing of best practices. We have what we call data meetings, which are focused on a particular topic of interest. For example, we've had meetings focused on different approaches, different perspectives from our members on centralization. We've also looked at data within the consortium to shed some light on research there. We've looked at student success metrics as well. So these offer our members some opportunities to be able to connect with each other. We also will have a member sometimes ask us a question about, other members in the consortium, and then really we just try to connect members one-to-one so that they can speak directly to each other and have those types of conversations. So Nikki, I'll turn it over to you to share your experience.
That's exactly right. The user summit, I've attended 2 user summits before the pandemic, and those user summits have been very helpful in connecting with colleagues across the US and of similar areas that we work with. And we all, it's great. It's kind of, it's therapeutic a little bit. We all struggle with similar things. So it's been a nice way to meet our colleagues. I feel then that I can email, call. It's Helio Campus gives me a kind of a foot in the door a little bit. So when I email somebody that I maybe haven't met yet, if I say I'm also part of the Helio Campus, and I'm asking about these things, they understand what I'm looking at and they understand why I'm asking some of the questions instead of just kind of cold calling them. So that has been helpful. The introductory emails have helped, and then I'll set up a video or phone calls again throughout the pandemic. Before that, it was just emails or phone calls. We're using the video a whole lot more
now. Perfect. So we have time for maybe 1 or 2 questions, depending on how long this next one is. So this next question is for you again, Nicole. Is there engagement with campus stakeholders that you wish you'd done more of early on that might have enabled greater digging in for insights or deeper use of the information at OSU? And then alternatively, what does that engagement look like?
I'm not sure if there's any that I wish I'd done more early on. Most of my stakeholders knew about, again, back it used to be APC Insights, the consortium. They knew it was from upper leadership, and so again, just being able to reach out to my colleagues, and being in the budget office, I'm in a unique spot that I know many of the people across the campus, and so when I reach out to my colleagues across campus, I say that I'm working on a Helio campus. I show them some of the results I'm getting. I'm like, this looks a little odd. Can you help me understand why this is happening? And for the most part, everybody has been very supportive and engaging. So I don't know if there's anything I would have changed early on. I feel like we're communicating with the folks that we need to at this point. And what does that engagement and what alternatively what it could look like? I could see as more again. I wouldn't blindly release the data, but with context, I feel like we can maybe share more with colleges. Maybe more college involvement would be helpful at the next step, or and department on our admin side.
Perfect. And we have time for one more question. So this one is going back toward the beginning of the presentation. So at one point there was a mention that, PMO, that you got started and learning more about that. So if it's not an IT PMO, what area does it report to?
And that was exactly the questions that we were asking. Where did PMO offices report to? Because oftentimes they do report up through the IT chain. Our office actually does not. It's in our Department of Finance and Administration in our DFA office with a strong connection and tie to our IT department. So I think, as we all know, that a bad process, if we just put IT on it, just makes it a faster bad process. So in order to make the process more streamlined, more efficient, more effective, we work on the process first in conjunction with our IT partners. So there's some analytical staff that works in our PMO office, and a lot of collaboration with our UIT department.
Perfect. Thank you very much. And like I mentioned, that's all the time we have for questions. Like I mentioned earlier, if there are any questions that we didn't get to today, then I'm sure that our friends over at Helio Campus will be willing to get back to your questions individually after today's webinar. And thank you again to our speakers for your time here today. Both of you, again, our audience appreciates it as well. And speaking of our audience, I would also like to thank our attendees for joining us today as well. For those of you who especially enjoyed our presentation, there are many more upcoming webinars like this one that are provided by University Business, which is the leader in editorial coverage of news, trends, and current issues in higher education. Our wide range of readers subscribe to us for free at UB, and they stay up to date with us through our print magazine, the digital edition, our newsletters, and our daily news letter as well. Also, for those of you who would like to watch this web seminar again, or for those of you who believe that the solutions provided would be helpful to your colleagues, you'll be pleased to know that there is an archive recording of this web seminar that will be available at in the URL that your browser is right there. You can also expect to receive an email from our team at UB at some point tomorrow, which will include a link to all of the slides as well as the on-demand video. And with that, on behalf of UB, this is Stephen Blackburn. Thanks, everyone, and have a great winter semester. Take care, be well, and stay safe, everyone.
Thank you.